It's a short one today, but it's a great lesson and something that we all could be reminded of every now and then. So, y'all stick around as we continue week 2 of Atypical. So, this picture was taken when I was maybe 7 years old. My family isn't normal. Notice anything here? One of these things just isn't the same here. Any of you that know my family at the church would know that both my parents are white and I am not. Shocker, I know. My mom and dad got divorced when I was very young, and then my mom met and married my stepdad when I was 6, about the time that picture was taken. I remember when I was younger and I would be with my mom and dad and they'd maybe be dropping me off at school. And some of the little kids at my school would go, what are you? How does your mom and your dad are both white and you're not? You're like, where did you come from, right? Because white plus white doesn't make brown. Some of your families might be like mine. You might be a little atypical. Maybe some of you are raised by your grandparents. Maybe you have only one parent at home. Maybe you have a blended family like mine. And we learned last week that even if your family is one mom and one dad, that your family still isn't normal, because no matter what your family looks like, there is no such thing as a typical family. Every family has imperfections, every family has problems, every family has struggles. But typical families, right, either try to handle those struggles on their own or they don't even handle them at all, whereas atypical families invite God into their imperfections, into their problems, into their struggles. And last week we said that there's no family too simple or too complex that God can't use, that your family can be used by God to do atypical things in this world. But the question is, how? I know that no matter what your family structure is, all of our families have disagreements sometimes. And last week we met the world's first family. We met Adam and Eve. We saw how their story went very wrong, very fast, as a result of their choices to disobey God and to hurt each other. But because God is a graceful God, He used their family to do something amazing, right? To one day bring Jesus into the world. And today, I want to introduce you to another family. They lived many generations after Adam and Eve, and they were atypical in their own ways. You may have heard about Abraham before. He's an important person in the history of our faith because of an important promise that God made to him. Father Abraham. Okay, no. And what I want to do is learn a little bit in Genesis chapter 13 more about Abraham's life and specifically his relationship with his nephew Lot. So in Genesis chapter 13, starting in verse 5, we read this. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. So we see that Abraham's family is very similar to probably how a lot of our families are. They fight and they argue. And Abraham comes up with the solution so that they don't fight so much. And in verse 8, we continue to read. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So Abram and Lot were fighting so much that they were like, we just need to go our separate ways. We just need to, you go that way, I'll go this way, so that we stop fighting and arguing. And so they decide to move to two completely different cities. Now we'll get back to Lot in a second, but let me tell you just a little bit more about Abraham so you can understand just how atypical his family really was. In Genesis chapter 18, we read this. Then the Lord said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She's in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you in about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." So Abraham and Sarah were really old. They didn't have any kids, but they were visited by messengers from God who said that Sarah was going to have a baby. Could you imagine your grandmother coming and telling you that God had sent her messengers to say that she was going to have a baby? You'd probably be a little bit concerned about grandma's mental health. Down and play me a video game. Psst. Grandson. Grandma, what are you doing here? God said I'm going to have a child. Grandma, you're 85 years old. You can't have children. God said it. How did you even get out of the nursing home?
Don't ever do that again. Do you hear me?
Just expressing myself.
No. Not like that, you're not.
And that's how atypical Abraham's family was. Okay, now back to Lot. Abraham and Lot had a long history of disagreements. Remember, they argued so much that they had to move to two different cities. And when God sees the sin of both Sodom and Gomorrah, and remember, Lot and his family were living in Sodom, God says, look, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin is just too bad. They can't be around anymore. And Abraham cries out in Genesis chapter 18, and you can go read it, and says, hey, you wouldn't kill the righteous with the wicked, would you? What if I found just 50 people that were righteous in Sodom? Would you spare the city then? And God says, sure, I would do that. And he says, okay, what if I found 45? God says, okay. He said, what if I found 40? And he whittles God down to just saying, if I can just find 10 righteous people, will you spare Sodom? And God says, okay, that's fine. And so Abraham, as he's talking to God in this moment in Genesis chapter 18, is pleading for the life of his nephew Lot, essentially. And in chapter 19, right after God has destroyed Sodom, Abraham returns to the place where he was praying, where he was speaking with God, and he looks down on the cities and he sees the aftermath of God's destruction. In Genesis chapter 19, verse 27, we read this. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and looked up, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in the land in which Lot lived. So we see that when when God was going to destroy Sodom, Abraham made a choice. He pleaded with God on Lot's behalf, and in response to Abraham's prayer, Lot and his family were saved. They were taken out of the city before God destroyed it. Last week, We said that if you want God to use your family to do some atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something atypical. And that's exactly what Abraham did. Listen, when you're fighting with someone in your family, it's not really typical to do what Abraham did. I know that some of you guys have siblings, and if God came and said, I'm going to destroy the city where your brother lives, you'd go, good, he deserves it. He deserves it. Right? The typical response is to fight back, to hold a grudge, to give the silent treatment. But Abraham chose to do the atypical thing. He prayed for Lot in the middle of their conflict. He didn't want an apology. He reached out first through prayer. And this might seem simple, but it's so atypical because not so typical families pray for each other. Abraham saw prayer change his family for the better. And every family has imperfections, has problems, has struggles. But atypical families invite God into those situations through prayer. Listen, prayer is something that I feel like we in the church have made so complicated, but it doesn't have to be. It's as simple as saying, God, thank you for my family, even if I'm not sure what that means right in this moment. It's as simple as asking God to give you those fruits of the Spirit that we talked about: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, right? Remembering those things in prayer as you ask God, hey, give me patience with my family. Give me peace with my family. It's as simple as asking God to give you wisdom on how to resolve a disagreement or an argument, or asking God to do the same for that family member that you're fighting with. Think right now about a recent disagreement that you've had with a family member, or a disagreement that maybe you even seem to have often. And imagine for a second how that conflict could be transformed if instead of fighting with your family, you took those problems, those disagreements, those arguments to God in prayer first. And how do you think that prayer could change your attitude, could change your temper, could change your perspective? And how do you think that prayer could change the person that you're fighting with? It's interesting that Abraham chose to pray for Lot before they ever reconciled. When God said, hey, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham didn't say, oh my goodness, I need to run down to Sodom to go tell Lot, to try to get him out of there, to try to help him, to try to save him. He went to God first, and he prayed to God before they ever even reconciled and fixed their relationship. Because in the middle of their conflict, Abraham went to God first instead of continuing to fight. So this week, my challenge to you is this: what if you decided to go first? Remember, not so typical families pray for each other. So maybe you need to take the first step. If you can commit to praying for your family more than you fight with them, imagine how God might be able to use your family to do some atypical things in the world. Y'all have a fantastic week.